Okay, next up, Amy. Amy, I discovered Amy a while back. I don't remember how. Somebody told me she was making light projections. And I love the idea of an artist who works with light. And she's been doing that different places. She's been an artist in residence. Were you an artist in residence in Japan recently?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
2 different
Japan. So now you can say 2 continents at least. Ready to go?
Oh, I guess I can just jump right in. So a little bit of background about my work. All of my work deals with sort of our relationship between our sort of mental self and our physical bodies. And I sort of explore this issue through our experience of space. So a lot of my works are video projections and video installations that sort of transform the space of the gallery or the museum. And a lot of the works create sort of an illusionary space that we sort of imagine in our minds. And in this piece, this is an extension to sort of the existing wall. So it's sort of like an imagined triangular space that extends from the existing wall. And what's sort of interesting in these works is sort of the range of reactions that I get from people. And in this piece in particular, the gallery where it was shown, it was sort of a family-oriented gallery, so there were a lot of children there at the opening. And what I thought was so wonderful is that children run right up to the wall and they touch it, and they're sort of like, is this here? And they ask their parents, and I can sort of hear them ask their parents. And that's a sort of wonder that I'm hoping to tap into, is sort of what is real and what is not, and how things can sort of sometimes exist in this in-between space between the two. Because in viewing these works, it's sort of like, you know you're in this limited physical space, but at the same time your mind is sort of telling you that there's this extension to the space and that there's this other world beyond the wall there. So it's sort of like your mind and your body are telling you 2 different things. And in this talk, I'm going to touch a little bit on various fields of study that sort of have influenced my work. And it's not super apparent when you look at the works, but I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done about space and how people in various fields of study have looked at space and addressed the idea of space. Space is a huge subject matter, and some people think of it as a void and as nothingness, but space is sort of the most immediate medium through which we experience the world. Everything that comes to us in a sensory manner comes through space, and so it sort of influences and affects everything that we know and feel in this world. And in this piece, sort of touch on that idea. This is actually installed in a corridor space, and there's 18 layers of fabric, and each layer gets smaller and smaller. So when you stand at the front, you can't see it from the side or anything, but from the front, because of the way the light comes through the fabric, it sort of looks like an infinite void or an infinite space that's sort of an indeterminate that you can't quite sort of map out in your mind. In Buddhism, space and consciousness are sort of considered elements, and space is sort of the thing that allows objects to take form and come into being. And space is also something that, as we know, it only exists for one moment in time, so the idea of the now becomes really important in space. And in this work, there's a projection on the wall and a projection on the floor, and there's sort of imaginary extensions to the space again. So there's sort of, but in these images, because they're staircases, you sort of have to imagine where these staircases lead. So there's like sort of another layer there, and sort of following that Buddhist sort of theme. I like to think of these installation spaces because oftentimes they take up an entire room. I like to think of them as meditative spaces as well. So in a way, they're dark and there's limited light, so you go in and you sort of just like spend time experiencing the actual installation space as well as the sort of imaginary projected space. And in philosophy, sorry. in philosophy, an early question that's asked is sort of, is space real or is it ideal? Is it something that exists as its own entity, or is it something that is a relationship between two objects or multiple objects? And how does the mind represent space? How do we actually understand it when we think about it? And I feel like this is sort of also a key question in my own work, because I guess I don't know the answer, and that's why I want to keep making art, to try and figure out what the answer is, or maybe there isn't an answer. But how do we understand space through a conscious mind, and what does it mean to actually have a representation in our minds of something that's three-dimensional, that we actually can move through? And then this image, it was a site-specific piece, so it was designed specifically for this wall, but it's again sort of an extension of the existing space. And I guess I should step back now that you've seen a few images and describe how these images are actually made. And these are actually photographs of miniature architectural models that I built. But they're always photographed in a way so that they don't feel like miniature spaces. I'm hoping they feel like real spaces that could exist in your memory, or in a dream, or in something that you've seen in the past. And so even though they're sort of miniature in our own minds and in the way we experience them, they become real spaces. And I also feel sort of like that in looking at these works, it sort of reveals our sort of humanness, basically. So I don't know for a fact, but I don't think that if an animal looked at it that they would be convinced of what this image is. Like, they wouldn't have that same idea of space that we have when we look at it. So to me, it's sort of something unique about our level of consciousness. Not that animals aren't conscious, but. And also going along, I guess, the trajectory of philosophy, the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, he sort of talks about this question of realism versus idealism as sort of a moot point, because it sort of overlooks the fact that arguing like whether or not space is sort of something that exists on its own, or if it's something that's a relationship, we're forgetting that in all of our understanding of this world, we're sort of looking at it through the lens of consciousness and through the lens of our body moving through space. So he sort of begins to point out that our sensory experience of the world is sort of shaping what we understand. So it shapes what we understand of space. And as we move through space, our minds are kind of constantly restructuring like our map of the world around us. So in a way, he's sort of saying space is a form of perception, and the body is sort of an intermediary between the outside world and our consciousness inside. In this image, this is was the first time that I did a print, not a projection. And this is a huge print on a wall. It's about 25 feet tall and 11 feet wide. And it's in sort of a stairwell. You can see a better shot of it here. But basically, as you move from the first floor up to the third floor, your view of the image sort of changes. So from below, you're sort of like looking up, and then when you get to the landing there, you can sort of see into this imagined stairwell, and then you get to the top, and you can again look down and see the whole thing. But this piece sort of takes into account your movement through the actual space of the museum as you're viewing the work. And again, this is a photograph of like a miniature model, a miniature architectural model.
Which museum?
Sorry, what?
Which?
That's at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. Do you know that space? There's the stairwell like right when you come into the galleries. And then an interesting thing is that we can't really ever have an idea of non-space. Like, what would that sort of be? I have no idea. The absence of space seems impossible to imagine. And we can imagine empty space, but not non-space. Sort of like the idea of without speaking too much about science, something that I'm not an expert on, but sort of like if we were to imagine the moment right at the Big Bang, it seems so impossible for most of us. Because everything is sort of existing in one point. And in this work, it's sort of touching on, it's not quite non-space, of course, but in this work, I sort of rounded out the corners of the gallery. And so when you come in, you sort of see this void in the corner of your eye, and you can't quite map out what's going on there. And it all has to do with sort of the way it's lit and the way it's curved, and basically there's no point for your eye to sort of, because there's no edges, there's nowhere where the light sort of creates shadows, and there's nowhere where your eye can actually be like, oh, this is where one thing ends and the other begins. And another interesting thing about space is that it sort of can't really be broken down into parts. It's hard to sort of, space is sort of fills everything, and it's hard to say like just this area of space or this area of space. And so it becomes something that is really intangible and kind of permeates all of everything that we move through and exist in. Bertrand Russell's thinker, he wrote this essay that I found to be sort of influential in my thinking, and it was titled Psychology of Space, but he sort of talks about remembered space and imagined space, and how it relates to real space that we're actually experiencing. And part of what he argues is sort of that maybe there isn't really a difference between imagined space and real space. And in some of my works, I try to explore this idea. So there's this, in the gallery works, it's sort of like you walk into the gallery and there's the actual physical space that you are existing in. And then there's sort of this imagined illusionary space that's being projected on the wall that you sort of, it's human scale, so usually it's like easier to imagine sort of entering that space or imagining that it's a real place somewhere. But then, like, for example, in this work, there's sort of this window on the side, and you don't know what's outside of that window, so you begin to imagine, again, another layer of space that's beyond what you can actually see. So it's sort of all these layers of space, and the question is, what is our experience? How does the experience of each of those differ? And on some level, I agree with Russell that there isn't any sort of difference, but at the same time, of course, through our bodily experience, there is a difference. Like, we can't actually walk into that space. But I guess the question sort of is, do we have to walk into a space to understand it or to imagine it, and to have a meaningful experience of it? And without, this is another shot. Those two images were sort of facing each other, but they're similar to the previous images that I showed before, so they're just sort of extensions of the existing space. And without talking too much about science, since I'm not an expert, but I'll mention sort of things that have influenced my thinking and have been sort of curious to me. From a biological sort of standpoint, our bodies have evolved to experience space in 3 dimensions. So even the way that we are physically built is designed so that we can understand space and move through space in a sort of relatively smooth way. So sort of like gravity is sort of our sixth sense, and we've evolved to experience gravity on this planet, and we can walk without tripping and falling and without our legs sort of flying up in the air. Our bodies are designed to sort of control how we move through space, but also how we understand space, just like depth perception and how we see and how we map out the world, and how we're two different eyes that can work together to basically create a visual understanding of the world around us. And in this image, again, it's an extension to the real space, but in this one I sort of included this area that is of an undeterminate sort of space. So with the architectural extensions, it's sort of very obvious, sort of like I'm telling you these are the walls and I'm extending. But in creating this void in there, it's sort of like, okay, well, now I'm also adding a non-space into this architectural defined space. And also in this image, the floor is actually a photograph of the real floor, so the floor sort of extends into the image as well.
Is that a projection?
That's a projection, yeah. So again, without talking too much about science, since I'm not an expert, I'm also interested in sort of the physics behind space, and that one of the questions in my mind, and I don't know what the answer is, but sort of what are the implications of the idea that space is actually curved, and it's not actually, the way we actually understand it is not the way it actually is. Because I think it's, for most people, maybe it's quite difficult to sort of imagine the fourth dimension and what, how space and time are connected, because we experience so much of our world in 3 dimensions, and time itself, we can't really sort of move back and forth. And but what I'm attracted to is sort of this idea that as we experience our lives through time, we're actually also experiencing it as it changes through space. And another sort of interesting point to me is sort of that basically for us, we can't really exactly know where things are, and not for like large objects, obviously, for like small, very small subatomic objects. There's just the idea that basically we can't actually know where something is, and once we shine a light on it to try and figure out where it is, then it's actually probably changed itself. And this is an image of basically a laser cut grid, and I layered the grid here. I'll just show the image so you can see it, but I layered the grid so that it would look sort of like a space, infinite space. And I guess one of the questions I often get is, do I digitally create a lot of these images, or is there sort of a lot of manipulation? And there isn't. Like the light and the yellow that you see in this image is all created in studio, so I actually like lit it with a yellow filter, and the light is what the actual light was. So it's not like I changed it in the computer afterwards. All I do in the computer afterwards is to sort of like crop it and clean up specs and stuff like that. So I also think that it's sort of an interesting thing, like photographing this object that isn't quite a space is very much an object. It's like they're usually about like this big, like 6 inches by 4 inches by.
This, like this?
Like that was as well. That was like 6 inches tall maybe, and then 4 inches wide, and then another 4 inches deep, or maybe 5 or 6 inches deep. But there are these little objects that I don't quite register as spaces, and then in photographing them, they sort of become transformed from objects to believable spaces. But I like that they sort of never actually exist as spaces, so they only ever exist in our imaginations, sort of. And in architecture, we sort of think of architecture as a way of organizing space and organizing how we move through space. Gaston Baudrillard, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, he wrote The Poetics of Space, but in his book he sort of talks about space as being this thing very much tied to memory and sort of past experiences, and that our homes are sort of these places filled with memories, and as we move through them, we're not experiencing them as they really are now, but we're experiencing them through all the experiences and all the things that we've sort of done in those particular spaces. And I like to also think of architecture as sort of, I think we often, once something is sort of built, we think of it as like a permanent building that can't be changed, but architecture is actually really fluid and flexible. And in doing these sort of illusionary images, I'm hoping that I'm sort of pointing that out as well, that architecture is not something as permanent as we think it is. So in this piece, I projected an extension on the ceiling. It's an imagined staircase. This is the last image. This is a piece that's up right now at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. I don't have a shot of the installation because it just opened last week, this last Friday. But it's this image projected on the wall, and along with sort of what Baudrillard said, I also teach art in a prison, and so that sort of in a way informs part of how I think about space. But what I've learned through the guys there is that even something like a prison cell over time becomes a home and a place filled with memories. so our sort of human need to nest or whatever is, even in a place where your individuality is sort of like taken away from you, it's still a strong desire to make a place that you can call home. And the guys actually call their cells home, which was to me sort of striking when I first went. And I guess the last sort of thought is that I'm hoping that through all of this work, or my reason for sort of doing this work is that I hope that in thinking about how we exist in space, we can sort of better understand ourselves as physical beings and as conscious beings, and then also to appreciate that since we all have bodies, we all have this sort of consciousness, and that we should sort of respect each other's consciousness, basically. That's the last.
Okay.
So I have a question about all of these pictures that you've shown. You made them by making some kind of three-dimensional thing about this size.
Yeah,
and then you did various lighting things in that, and took a photograph of that, and then you use a projector like that.
Just like that, yeah.
On the wall.
But
you hide it so that people don't see this, probably.
They're usually on the ceiling, and you can see them, but they always line up with the edges of the room so that they continue on from like room into projection. And
so that means that you have to either move this or the lens and have measured the room that you're going to put it in and all of that sort of thing.
I guess I don't want to get too technical, but I use short throw projectors, which can throw a really big image in a short space. So I can usually fill a wall in about something that's half the distance of the actual, like whatever the size of the wall is in half that distance, I can throw an image.
What's the kind of projector?
It's called a short throw projector.
Short what?
Short throw.
Short throw.
Yeah. And then I also, in software afterwards, make them so that they fit the wall exactly.
So you mentioned time briefly. Okay? For an artist who's so obsessed with space, what is time? Then I can tell you my personal experience seeing your pieces. That has to do with time, actually.
Some of the pieces, and I didn't mention it because it wasn't all of them, and I don't have, the video documentation is often quite slow and difficult to watch, but some of the pieces are videos, and the light maybe changes slightly over time, but not all of them. But it's usually something where you might come in and see it and you wouldn't notice that it was changing, and you leave and then come back and then it might have shifted already. You'd be like, oh wait, is that the same image? But they move so slow that it's difficult to perceive that they move. But I guess, are you asking sort of like what I think of time, or?
Well, I mean, so I've seen a few of these, as you know, and my personal reaction is that it actually emphasizes the sense of time. Precisely because I am in something that is designed, sometimes it's an open space. I have the feeling it's like you're trying to move the walls. And the net result is actually I feel the passage of time more than I wouldn't otherwise, you know.
That's an interesting.
So I was wondering if that's intentional.
I guess it's intentional in the sense that I do want people to stop and think, and it's sort of like taking you out of normal space and time in a way, like forcing you to like pay attention to something that maybe you normally wouldn't. Like when I go in a room, I don't like look at the walls and stuff like that. But in this sense, I'm sort of making you look at the room, something that we wouldn't normally look at. And I think in that way, maybe it suspends time because we're sort of taken out of the normal play of time or something.
Yes.
These are really striking images, and I was wondering, since you do start with a physical object, as the question back here, and you don't manipulate the images, I wonder if you thought of intentionally manipulating the images to introduce different shading or different perspective, such that the majority of the image might seem absolutely realistic, but there's something wrong with it, because it no longer fits what we expect to see.
I'd like to think that most of these don't conform to sort of our normal expectations of space. And I left out an image of a recent piece, but I actually built one of the models in real life scale recently. And that's something I actually want to continue to do because it sort of reverses what I've been doing, and that I'm creating a real space that feels fake, as opposed to like a fake space that feels real. So maybe that sort of addresses what you're pointing out.
Yeah, I think for me, the illusions that you've produced are the exciting thing about it. And except for the round one, it seems like you're dependent upon sort of the perspective of, the Renaissance invented perspective that you use, in a very clever and novel way. Is that true? Is that one of the learnings that you?
I think that's sort of, to me, or maybe this is just me, but that's sort of when I think of how to depict space, that's what I think of, like either in a painting or whatever, or in a photograph, is to exaggerate the sort of perspective. But also in these pieces, they become sort of weird in real life because you'll stand at a certain angle and one line will line up exactly, and then you'll move and that line will shift, and then the other line on the other side will line up perfectly. So they're sort of like, it's almost as, sometimes it feels like the illusion is actually shifting, but a lot of times they're still images, so they're not actually shifting.
So I wonder, one of the things I just thought about was, there's a different kind of spatial feeling to Chinese art,
Yeah.
classical Chinese art. And I'm wondering if you've ever thought of experimenting with that.
I was just recently in Asia, so I've been thinking about that. But yeah, like in Asian art, it's very flat. Spaces are very flat, and they're not depicted in this sort of same way like Renaissance perspective. So I guess I don't quite have an answer, but it is something I've been thinking
There are
about.
huge mountains and tiny figures and a huge sense of space for me, even on a flat.
Okay.
I have a really easy question. Were you trained as an architect?
No.
Oh.
No, yeah. I started doing video work. Yeah.
Have you, or do you know anyone who's considered doing kind of an Escher-inspired, actual physical of an
I
Escher-inspired?
didn't show images of that piece, but I have a piece where I projected a bunch of staircases on a real staircase. So that real staircase had all these surfaces under it. So I projected all these other staircases going in impossible directions, sort of. So that was the closest that I got, I guess, to the sort of Escher idea. But I didn't show that in this, since it was limited time, yeah.
Yes.
I actually have a few questions. One, what prison is he?
Oh, San Quentin?
Cool, I'm supposed to go to a reading there this weekend. But then, do you freaking have the menu you said you work with? Do they have these? Do they end up with these kind of things in their cells, or something along those lines?
What do you mean these
You're
things?
talking about the
something
prisoners.
like,
Do they do this kind of thing in prison?
No, I think the work that they do, or at least that I work with them on, is much more like tangible and physical. We have limited technological stuff in there, so there's no cameras or computers.
No, not
and
even
stuff. Is that what
projection,
you
but
mean?
even just, like a window or something, like, you know what I mean? Like if they don't have a window, like a picture of a window is.
I would say they use their artwork as a way to imagine spaces that they can't actually be in. So a lot of them actually do traditional landscape painting, because that's something that they just, some of the guys have been in for 40-something years, so they haven't seen that in a really long time, but they still imagine it, and so that it comes out through their work. But usually they're working in pretty traditional mediums.
And then one of the pieces was like a thing, maybe you said it was without shape, and it was, I don't know if it was you, but it was someone, like in a raincoat standing on a thing.
Oh yeah, that was me.
Is that the way that piece is supposed to be, like you're supposed to stand in the space?
That was ideally, but then it was going to get really dirty, and all this sort of like logistical stuff that we ended up not letting people go in it. Because even when you don't have your socks on, or you don't have your shoes on, your socks will still make a print on the, was what I realized. So it became a sort of logistical thing where people couldn't really actually go in. So that's why it was just me standing in there. But the piece itself is empty normally. Like there's nothing, it just looks like a void.
But that's like ideally, I guess, how you like it.
Yeah, ideally I'd want people to walk in.
And I want to.
Let's take a short break. Let's thank Amy first.